Galahad and the Grail is one of the most exciting new books of poetry that has come out in recent years. At least I've been excited about it, partly because it's one of those old things that we used to write a lot of, narrative poems. And it's retelling of a story you're probably familiar with. It's the story of Sir Galahad and the search for the Holy Grail. It goes from Galahad's childhood, living in a cursed kingdom, his journey to Camelot to become an Arthurian knight, and then his quest for the Holy Grail, sometimes aided, sometimes alone. This is a poem that has characters that you might be very familiar with: Arthur, Guinevere, Lancelot, but they're not the main characters. Lancelot's a supporting character. Arthur and Guinevere are kind of hardly in it. But if you're interested in Galahad and his search for the Holy Grail, if you're interested in other knights like Percival and Bors, if you like Gawain and like Gawain in funny situations, you'll like this. You'll like this poem. Now, the poem is about 7,757 lines by my count. It's divided up into 3 books, and each book has between 7 and 8-ish sections in it. Guite calls them staves. The first book of staves is a little over 1,000 lines. The second book is about 2,300 lines. And the third book is over 5,000 lines. So as the books go on, the stories get more involved, the subplots become more intense, and the themes, the lore, the depth of vision, both theological and fantastical, become more and more intense. It's interesting that this poem has just been published now at this point in history. So before we get into the text more, let's talk about the context. The 19th century was filled with masterful and popular narrative poems, from Byron's Don Juan to Longfellow's Hiawatha to Rossetti's Goblin Market to Tennyson's Idylls of the King. Outside of English poetry, poets like Alexander Pushkin invented whole new genres of narrative poetry, like the verse novel. Robert Browning even wrote a historical mystery in verse, The Ring and the Book. But the modernists did away with the vogue of narrative poems. Soon after the last great narrative poems of the turn of the century, like Tennyson's late narratives and Chesterton's Ballad of the White Horse, Eliot's The Waste Land and Pound's Cantos changed the course of Western poetry. These poems deal with many of the same themes as Byron, Browning, and Tennyson, but in elusive, fragmented lyric sequences, divorced intentionally from narrative coherence. The coherences of modernist lyric, when present, are conceptual coherences, and, ironic as it may seem, formal coherences. Some might say that the modernist poets were bad at telling stories. They might have been. More particularly, they stopped using poems to tell stories. The past few decades of English poetry have seen, in fits and starts, attempts at reclaiming and resuming the narrative poetic tradition. This has been arguably most successful when it comes to the verse novel. Anne Carson's autobiography of Red is a good example of a coherent and readable narrative poem that mimics pretty well the conventions of mid-century magical realism. It can be easy to forget that the poem is a poem, however, because it reads like a literary novella. Rhyme, regular meter, they're nowhere to be found, and one gets the impression that if they were to be found, Ms. Carson would be rather embarrassed. Other narrative poems, like Derek Walcott's Omeros, is a little more at home in its poetic heritage, retelling the Odyssey in a modern Caribbean context. Still, regular meter and rhyme are avoided. So are they avoided in the many recent attempts at verse novels for YA readers, some of which have won prestigious awards, like Ellen Hopkins' Glass or The Poet X by Elizabeth Acevedo. There are, however, exceptions to this unspoken rule of narrative poetry is okay as long as it doesn't sound like traditional poetry. The New Formalist movement gave us the blank verse epics of Frederick Turner, the ballad-like short narratives of Dana Gioia, and several Pushkinite sonnet novels like Vikram Seth's The Golden Gate and Michael Winegrad's Eugene Nadelman. Into this fray steps Malcolm Guite with his Galahad and the Grail. Born in Nigeria and educated in England, Guite himself has contributed to the new formalist movement over the last couple decades, but has so far published short formal lyrics rather than long narratives. An Anglican priest and chaplain at University of Cambridge, he has written several popular collections of poems focused on the church year. Sounding the Seasons and Waiting on the Word stand out as formally accomplished and earnestly devotional collections of sonnets that lead the reader through the fasts and feasts of the Christian Church. Alongside these devotional poems, Guite has also proved himself a scholar, particularly with his 2018 monograph Mariner, a study of Coleridge's life and narrative poetry. A couple of years ago, it came out that Guite was working on a long narrative Arthurian poem, and it piqued my interest. Guite had, it seemed, all the elements requisite to write a successful long narrative poem. He has a natural affinity for meter and rhyme, a deep knowledge of the English tradition of narrative poetry, and, this is important, the heart of a pastor for his flock, one who is trained to and has long practice at telling the old stories and truths to the people in the present. He has something neither Pound nor Eliot had, but something that Donne and Herbert did have, the office of the priest poet. Finally, Guite has the benefit of a context that is starved for traditional narrative poetry written for a popular audience. Turner, Weingrad, and others notwithstanding, the market is not saturated with good formal narrative poetry written for the popular reader. I would not blame someone if they called the narrative poetic scene currently a wasteland. So, does Guite succeed? From the vantage point of the poem itself, I say yes. It is yet to be seen if the poem can have the cultural impact that something like Tennyson's Idylls of the King or Coleridge's Ancient Mariner had. Poems don't work in our culture like they did in 19th century England. Poems still have power, however, and Guite's poem has power in spades. From the opening lines, it is clear that Guite has no interest in disguising his poem as a novel. It is an incantatory ballad, complete with long sequences of lines that all rhyme on the same sound, sometimes up to 7 or 8 times in a row. Forget rhyming couplets, Guite gives us rhyming octuplets at times. He does this in the context of the ballad stanza, the basic form of which is 4 lines rhyming A, B, C, B. However, the third line with the C rhyme is often doubled, tripled, quadrupled, and more. It is common to find stanzas of A, B, C, 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 B throughout the poem. This allows for quite a bit of flexibility in length and focus from stanza to stanza, and allows Guite to show off his ability to rhyme. However, he's not above reusing rhyming words between or even within the same stanza. This usually works with the general mood and movement of the ballad. A ballad must reflect and remind even as it moves the narrative forward. An especially effective example of this is the repetition of a major phrase each time a knight boards the enchanted ship of Solomon. Guite keeps coming back to the same variation of the line, and he has gone into the ship, and they have welcomed him into the ship, and so on. A similar repetition of the line, so I have taken up the tale, is wound lovingly throughout the poem. Guite's chosen diction for the poem moves from straightforward and common to occasionally archaic. For every "he has gone into the ship," we get a line like "to mount and ride full swift," which sounds more like Spenser or Mallory than even Tennyson. Best are those lines that avoid both archaism and colloquialism and rise to a clear Guitean grandeur, as in the couplet, "The living trees are on our side, by oak and ash and thorn we ride." Those who are put off by the Arthurian characters speaking like you'd expect them to, "Thy sword, thou dost, by our Lord in whom we trust," will no doubt roll their eyes, but it is worth saying that Guite manages to give his own unique context to these common tropes. This story is not quite Malory or Spenser or the musical Camelot, but it is informed by all of these. As I read the poem, it was most subtly the Arthurian Edmund Spenser and Torquato Tasso that I was reminded of, as much as the explicitly Arthurian Malory and Tennyson. And Guite gives himself some indication of his influences in the 3 epigraphs that begin the poem. The first is a prose quotation from David Jones about myth as a force to conserve, to develop, to bring together, to make significant for the present what the past holds. This mythic activity is, Guite suggests, what he is trying to do in his poem. The second epigraph is a short quatrain from Kipling about Merlin's Isle. Guite has made it clear that Galahad and the Grail is but one of several poems that all fit within a larger work called Merlin's Isle, an Arthuriad. And in fact, in the appendix to Galahad and the Grail, he says there are going to be 4 volumes of 3 books each, which will comprise the whole of Merlin's Isle, an Arthuriad. The final quotation on the epigraph page is the most interesting one to me. It's from Geoffrey Hill's poem Merlin, which is short enough to quote in full. I will consider the outnumbering dead, for they are the husks of what was rich seed. Now should they come together to be fed, they would outstrip the locusts covering tide. Arthur, Elaine, Mordred, they are all gone beneath the raftered galleries of bone. Under the long barrows of Logres they are made one, and over their city stands the pinnacled corn. Guite quotes the entirety of Hill's second stanza. Together with the Jones and Kipling quotations, these lines from Hill show the stakes and situation of Guite's poem. It is a myth for our time, a myth that invites us to Merlin's Isle, the mythic England, which is, after all, the England, or rather Logres, that undergirds our modern world. Logres, where Arthur lies, has been beneath us all this time. This is the work that Guite has given himself, one of retelling well for our time. In choosing the highly poetic ballad form and in setting his Arthurian narrative in the late antique past with its earnest faith and fairy elements, Guite has trusted that we do not need gritty retellings or subversive deconstructions. What is subversive in Guite's poem is that which he has seen as subversive in the old Arthur stories themselves, namely the figure of the knight who heals rather than harms, whose heart yearns not for some forbidden beloved, but for purity, for chastity. The knight who, having been born of adulterous deception and seduction, becomes the hope for the political, spiritual, and ecological restoration of the world. Whether a reader is willing to be caught up into such a story is up to each one who takes up Guite's poem. But those who do choose to adventure with Guite and Galahad will not, I don't think, be disappointed. The Wasteland. In interview after interview, as well as in the appendix to the book itself, Guite has been explicit about the ecological dimensions of the Galahad story. It's not just some fabled holy cup that Galahad seeks. It is the undoing of the curse that has affected his homeland. At a basic level, this curse kills living things, animals, trees, plants, etc. It also dries up the rivers, the springs, the wells. The dearth extends to the spiritual dimensions of earth, plant, and water. For the nymphs, the naiads, the dryads, they are all departed as well. And Galahad has the perilous chance to bring back not just the physical life of his home, but the spiritual enchantment that his whole world is lacking. Guite has recounted how his mother first told him about the wasteland when he was a boy, and she compared it, he says, to the devastation of the earth wrought by the atomic bombs that America dropped on Japan. Thus, Guite is not merely interested, in theological restoration, in spiritual restoration, though he takes those very seriously. But he sees, as perhaps a good student of the Inklings would see, that the restoration of the human spirit and the restoration of the created order, our ecology and our spirituality, are deeply connected. Galahad becomes the hero who can heal both. In doing so, Galahad effects a restoration that is longed for by T.S. Eliot, by Alfred Lord Tennyson, by Thomas Mallory, by all, including St. Paul, who speaks of creation crying out for the sons of God to be revealed. I'll be interested to see if we keep talking about Galahad and the Grail for many years. I hope we do. I hope it's also a book that joins with the other texts in Merlin's Isle and becomes, well, kind of a fairy queen for our age. We'll see. I'm looking forward to it. If you go on Amazon right now, you can see that pre-orders for the next volume in Merlin's Isle are already on sale. I think that comes out in October. We'll be back later in the year to see how Guite did. But by my estimation, this is a keeper.